Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2025 Minnesota Book Award finalists for the novel and short story category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota, and the novel and short story category is sponsored by the Minnesota Humanities Center. My name is Will Weaver. I'm a two-time Fiction Award winner, and my novel last year, Power and Light, was a finalist. But today's focus is all about our current contenders for the 2025 Novel and Short Story Award. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards' popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Loretta Ellsworth, author of The French Winemaker's Daughter, published by Harper Paperbacks, HarperCollins publishers; David Nash, author of In Wells Time, published by Unsolicited Press; Mubanga Kalimamukwento, author of Obligations to the Wounded, a collection of short stories published by the University of Pittsburgh Press; and Louise Erdrich, author of The Mighty Red, published by HarperCollins. Miss Erdrich is not with us today. In the interest of making the most of our short time together, I'm going to ask each author a round-robin question that I'd like you to respond to in turn. And then I'll have two questions specific to each of you and your fine finalist book. Let's begin. Most writers will say there's a spark, an image, an epiphany, something that tells you that this is a novel and that this is the novel I have to write. Was there such a moment for you?
There was a spark when I was writing my previous novel, Stars Over Clear Lake, another World War II novel that is set in Iowa. In that story, a farmer's daughter, her brother is in France fighting the Germans, and I did some research to find out where he might be fighting in France and what battles he might be in. And, as a writer, you do a lot of research and sometimes you go down rabbit holes. And I came across a book called Wine and War. And it was about the French, the Nazis, and the battle for France's most treasured resource, which is wine. And when I was reading that book, I had an image of this young girl hiding in her armoire with a bottle of wine that is her inheritance. Because I'd read about the ways that France had gone, to protect their wine, from burying it to building fake walls to putting on fake labels. And this image just came to me. And of course, I was writing the previous book, so it was just kind of in the back of my mind. But it was an idea that kept nagging at me until I finally decided to write it.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to a related question. And your novel alternates between the 1990s and World War II in France and the wine country. Could you say more about your research process, particularly viticulture, that whole ecosystem of wine and winemaking? How did you go about that research?
Well, much of this book was written during COVID. And so most of my research was done simply online or by reading books, lots of books about winemaking. I finally, in a couple of years ago, actually, I was finally able to travel to France and visit some wineries and get the atmosphere and the sense of what it was like, and asked a lot of questions, took a lot of notes. Of course, so much of what you learn does not end up in the book anyway, but I would say you learn just enough to sound like you're writing with authenticity, but that you know what you're talking about, but not always not always true. But
Well, may I say it's a great research area,
It
has
is,
many
right?
opportunities.
It is. So many of the book clubs that I visit, they always have wine. So I'm thinking this is perfect.
Excellent, excellent. One more literary question. You chose a structure of alternating narratives, a modern successful woman in America, and again, that scared young French girl in World War II. How those two narratives slowly merge, I will say, is one of the fun parts about reading your novel. Now, how did you manage that slow merging of the two narratives? Did you lay that out precisely ahead of time?
No, not exactly. When I first started out, I have written several novels for younger readers as well. And when I first started out with the story of the young girl, I didn't know if it was going to be a young adult novel. Um, but the wine bottle sort of led me to, want to pursue what happens to that later. And so the story of the woman who's an American pilot who 50 years later finds this bottle of wine, and the connection between the two, um, that came about later. And so I'm pretty much have always been more of a pantser in writing, where I don't really know where the story is going. But for this one, I did end up doing some plotting, which was really helpful, especially after I'd had the two storylines. I do read a lot of World War II novels, and I did a lot of research reading other novels that go back and forth between characters and time to help me decide how to plot this out.
Well, very interesting in terms of how different authors control their material. Thank you. One last question. Seems to me a good work of fiction, a good novel, offers something of value for the reader when they finish, something to carry forward and take away. Of your novel, what do you hope might be something useful and valuable that the reader could take away from the reading of it?
Well, one thing I think I hope my novel prompts readers to reflect on their own family heirlooms, um, to think about how personal artifacts connect us to the past. Um, my father had fought during World War II in Japan towards the end of the war and brought home a lot of Japanese items. One was this little, um, it looked like a handkerchief, and it had red sun on it and lots of Japanese writing. And I remember as a little girl taking it to show and tell. So, and it wasn't until after he passed away that we were looking through it. And I had a sister-in-law living in Japan. So I asked her to have it translated. And it turns out it was a good luck flag that was given to soldiers, Japanese soldiers going into battle with messages of hope and love from their families. So, so many items, personal artifacts, they always have a story behind them.
Thank you very much. And good luck on April 22nd, the award ceremony.
Thank you so much.
Family heirlooms and artifacts is a natural transition to our next author, David Nash, and his novel In Wells Time. Let me ask you that same question I've asked the other writers, David. Was there a moment, an image, a spark that was the key to you writing this particular novel?
Yeah, thank you for the question and the opportunity to chat with you. I guess I don't really remember too much when I don't remember the first time I sat down to write this, to be honest, but I do the thing that I always think back that I remember as being the beginning. If it really was, I don't know. But I remember after my first novel had come out in April 2020, so right during sort of the shutdown of things. And shortly after that, my son was learning to ride his bike, and I was spending a lot of time with him and my daughter, who's younger, and I remember waking up in the middle of the night and just in one of these little like panic things where just thinking about how fast time was going, kids growing up, and and then I got lost in this loop of like not great train of thought of like, space and eternity and all these things that are sometimes hard to grasp and think about, especially at 2 a.m. and I remember I just had to calm myself down. But I think that moment kind of sparked the train of thought of a question of sort of, well, what if I could slow down time, or what if you could hold on to a moment, a kid getting on a bus and when you hug them by for school, what happens with that, and what's the cost, and what would you do in a situation like that? And that, I think, is what got me starting to think and develop the characters and the story.
Yes, and that's a natural transition to my next question. Your novel clearly is deeply focused on the matter of family. And as you also put a finer point on it, the matter of familial gifts and curses. I'd love to hear more about where that idea came from.
Um, yeah, I think from the family standpoint, I guess I think of that as almost, there's like two answers to this. The family piece. I mean, so Wells is from a family of he has three siblings, and I have three siblings. And I think that was just a familiar way to think about it. My I have two brothers and a sister. Wells has three sisters. Uh, I the Without going to like therapy or something, I think that's about where the end of the some of the similarities between my family and Wells' family is. Um, but what I wanted to show in the book was there are different ways we use our time, and some of that is what we place our values in. So each of Wells' siblings and his parents value different things. And so I sort of think of each of them as a different kind of part of me. His older sister, his oldest, is very career driven and very focused on that. And then he has another sister, it's very family focused, and those relationships are super important. And then his younger sister is sort of emotionally driven and trying to find themselves. And so the family dynamic felt like, I guess it became a natural way to sort of explore for this family that's going through something that's difficult, which all families do, and the complexities of how we help each other and how we contrast to one another. It was a good way for me to work through thinking about how we spend our time. And so, uh, and because then, and it also worked because the nature of this sort of gift is genetic, and it was
Mhm.
something that we handed down, and we try and learn from our family members. And sometimes it's a secret that we don't really think about, or we don't share, or we're hesitant to share with each other. I think we're hesitant to, sometimes we're eager to share. Like, I'm eager to share with my kids my opinions about how they're doing something, but they may not want to hear yet, or learn from that. And that's
Mhm.
all part of the journey of life, and how we figure out, again, how we live and experience our day to day. The gift and the curse thing. Um, I think that everything, all of our decisions have costs, and
Mhm.
our choices. We can choose to do one thing, and that usually means we give up something else. And that became an essential piece to this gift. Is it a gift, but at what cost? And that, thinking of it that way, I think helped me sort of consider just, you know, or focus on the piece of, we should be intentional about, to the best of our ability, what we're doing in any day, and the relationships we're making, and those choices we make.
Yes, as you say in the back cover of your book, life is short, we blink and it is gone. So I think you're quite correct on that. And I want to ask you the third of four questions. Um, a good work of fiction doesn't end on the last page, gives the reader something to take away. I'm guessing you would maybe say something more about family and time to answer that question.
Yeah, I think with this book and anything I'm writing, I'm always hoping that, number one, I mean, I'm just trying to write a fun story kind of for myself. I'm writing something that I'm interested in. So if a reader takes away just that, they're like, that was fun, that was great, that is awesome and feels so good. But if they took it a step further, I think something from this is, whether it's our family relationships or it's the what we choose to focus on, in any season of our life, it's that, we take at least a moment to be somewhat intentional about it. And if we do that from the forefront, hopefully it leads us down a path that when we look back, we go, I feel good about that, and we can always change. You always think of regrets and hindsight's 2020 and all of those things, but at least you can say that, well, I meant to take that first step once the path was lit up for me. So if people take away something like that, just to be intentional about how they treat their relationships and their choices, I think that's great and awesome.
Yes, I like very much your point about living with intentionality. So one last question, David. The three other titles in our finalists for the Novel Short Story Award all come from mainstream publishers, either university presses or the so-called Big Five New York publishers. Can you tell us more about your small press, your indie publisher, how you came to connect with them, and the role of the small press in our current publishing landscape?
So I'm happy to give my opinions on it. I don't feel at all an authority to speak on some of those things, but first, my publisher, Unsolicited Press, is, as you said, it's an indie publisher. They're based out of Oregon and is just an awesome, small but mighty force of indie publishing with a goal to support indie authors and people who they believe have something important to say. They focus on poetry. This year is sort of the year of women, and so it's really lifting up that voice. And every piece they're publishing is speaking from that direction. And so I'm really thankful to be working with them, and I'm working with them on my next book as well. I found them basically when I wrote my first book. It was a strange thing. I was just sort of sitting down. I actually write music more frequently, and I was writing a song, and then the song had a story, and I thought, oh, maybe this could be a book. And so I just was like, I'm gonna try it. So I just sat down and tried to write. And I remember thinking, or I was with my wife, going like, what are you doing? And and are you thinking about what's the next step? And I took one English or like literature class in college, a women in fiction class taught by Catherine Swatson at Augsburg University in Minnesota. And I just emailed her. I was like, I've got this book and I don't know what to do. How does one get published? Honestly, I had no clue. And so I started by emailing an old professor, and they connected me to some other professors who sort of gave me the overview of how publishing works in general, without they kind of, it was, I guess, the Cliff Notes version. But they did mention Unsolicited Press because a recent Augsburg grad had published a poetry selection from there. And so that was how I found them initially. And I went through the process of just submitting lots of queries to publishers, mostly independent, regional. The idea of my understanding was to kind of get with the Big Five. You have to get, or either an agent is really helpful. And that seemed daunting. I didn't even know the first step with that. There's so many, I think of, independent publishers, which tend to be smaller, hybrid publishing models, which can help you in different ways where you're putting some money into that. Your big traditional publishing houses. And then of course there's self-publishing now, which is so available and allows you to get your work out. It seems like right now for authors, for anyone who's looking at publishing, like if I were to go back and talk to myself again, I might say, what what are your goals for this project? Is this something that I want to share just with my kids and maybe my family? Then I think like, you know, the direct publishing route, self-publishing is awesome, and a really good way to do it. I think if you're looking for just to see how far you can go, there's great ways to submit your work to lots of people and just see who connects with it. Um, I've found that it's still a big learning process for me, and I often feel like I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just going to keep writing and trying to share stories, and I have just as many questions of like, how does one get into a university press and the big five publishers? I'm super interested in how that works, just because it all is such a neat, there's so many neat routes of how to share work. So I don't know if that does a good job answering your question, but.
It does indeed. There are many routes to publication. Miss Kalimamukwento, I was very pleased to read your story collection. They're my first love as a writer. And I have a question about it. What was that first moment, that first image, that spark when you knew you wanted to do a short story collection?
The moment came from outside of myself. So when I first started writing short stories, I have come to love short stories, I think, as much as you do. But my first language in writing was novels. So I started with a novel before I ever tried to write a short story collection or even a short story. So when I first started writing short stories, I was doing it to keep myself busy while waiting to hear back about my novel. And I actually didn't think that I could do it to start off with. Somebody just said, why don't you just try and write a short story? And the more short stories that I read, the more that I fell in love with them. Uh, and that extends to how the idea of the collection started out, in that a friend of mine is the one who mentioned it. So she had just read what became the last story in the collection. And she said, oh, I'd love to see this in a collection one day as maybe the opening story or the final story. And I think that was when I first started thinking about like the idea of a short story collection, if maybe I'd like to put my stories together one day. So this was maybe 7 years ago. I want to say 7 years ago, when I wrote that story, maybe 6 years ago that I wrote that story. And then little by little, the collection started to come together. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. A good work of fiction, it seems to me, does not end on the last page of the last story. It gives the reader something to carry forward. When a reader finishes your collection, what do you hope is an important takeaway for that reader?
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I agree with the idea that a good story lingers with you long after you have finished reading it, and this manifests in different ways. For me, in the last few years in my writing, I've been thinking a lot about proverbs, and you see them throughout the collection, and you will see them in other writing that I'm publishing this year and next year, and probably for a long time to come. But I've been thinking about how proverbs operate in Zambian storytelling, specifically the role that they play, how the proverb is more than the beginning of the story, how the proverb can be the story itself. And this idea that the person who is telling the story and the person who is listening or reading the story, that they are co-creators, that they're both actively participating in the outcomes of the protagonist and everybody else in the story. And I liked to think about the proverb at the beginning of the story as well as at the end of the story. Mm-hmm. Which is to say that I really don't have specific ideas of what my readers should take away from the story. I think what we take away from any story ends up telling us something about ourselves, and that's not something that the writer can impose. That's more about what the reader is bringing to the story, the expectations that they have based on the lives that they've lived or where they are in that exact moment. So I'm more interested in hearing the different versions of the different reactions that people have to especially the more open-ended questions, the more open-ended stories. I'm always interested in the second story specifically. People always ask me like, well, what did she do? And I'm always just like, what do you think she did? And everybody has a different answer. And that is the most satisfying reaction to me, just getting to know more about people based on how they interpret that open-endedness of a story.
Thank you. I want to ask you a little closer, more literary question about your collection. In it, you choose often to use non-standard formatting of paragraphs, of dialogue, even punctuation sometimes. Was that a calculated choice, or did it come naturally from the characters, from their psychologies and their sometimes difficult situations?
A combination of things. In the opening story, it had to do with just the fragmented nature of the relationship between the protagonist and her mother, and the distance, the physical distance and sometimes the emotional distance between herself and her sister. And so the form of the story, mimicking this fragmentedness of, physical and mental state, came naturally as a result of that story. Some of them were a little bit more guided. So hashtag Bailey Lies is told as social media back and forth. And that one was a result of a prompt. I was in a class, and the prompt was to write about a disgraced memoirist, someone who writes a memoir that is later discovered to be completely false. And so it was a little bit guided by that. I was thinking about, well, what kind of stage would have to be available in order for this memoirist to be like disgraced in this way. A lot of the time it was just how the story came to me. I don't think there were many times or ever any times where I was thinking, what's the cleverest way to tell this story? They just kind of came out that way. So it was more led by the story and the characters than it was by any, deliberate planning on my part.
Well, it seemed natural and just exactly right, may I say. Let
Thank
me
you.
ask you one last question. Your stories focus on a dozen Zambian women negotiating culture and customs between what I would say old Africa and new America. And one story in particular, Hail Mary, about a youngish woman caught by immigrations and customs police, or
Mhm.
ICE, seems extraordinarily relevant to this truly current moment.
Mhm.
And I wonder if, as an attorney, could you speak to your work in what we could call the real world and how it intersects with your fiction?
Mhm. This is a great question. There are many layers to this question. So to start with, this idea of negotiating one place with another, like your question about form, this the duality of place in the collection happened quite organically because these stories were written over a space of about 5 years. The way that they appear in the collection isn't necessarily the order in which I wrote them. But once I had the collection together, I could see that the women were either in one place or another, looking back or looking forward. And so then that helped me arrange them in that sort of way of like in one story they're in Zambia, in the next they're in a different location. So it started from there. Hail Mary is one of my older stories. I wrote it in 2018. So, it's sad to me that a story that I wrote, it's not that long ago, but long ago enough that it shouldn't feel so current, right? It shouldn't feel like I'm writing in response to something that I'm seeing or experiencing right now. But yes, I wrote it in 2018. I was on a legal fellowship at the time, and I observed some immigration court hearings over a couple of days. And one thing that I was struck by was just the swiftness of the hearings, especially when factoring in that a lot of people that I was observing, English wasn't their first language. So the translation was relatively quick and it was just kind of in and out. And I was just really, really struck by that. Obviously, at that point, I had been practicing law for a while, but I had never really done an immigration case. I was doing criminal law, but nothing like what I was observing there. So it stayed with me for that reason. Beyond that story, I'm not really sure that my legal experience or knowledge really shows up in my creative work, in part because I think when I'm writing creatively, I'm actually moving away from anything that I'm dealing with or thinking about in like the day-to-day. The only exception to that is I do have a novel coming out next year where most of the novel is set in a courtroom. And I think that would be the first that's the first piece of work where as I was writing it, I was thinking about like my active experience in the courtroom and how I could use the things that I know to help me tell the story, better. Yeah, so this is a pretty old story, and in the first version, the protagonist is a man, and I changed it after I had finished the collection. I realized that most of the people in my collection were women, and I wanted a cohesiveness to the way the voices were being told. So, yeah.
Well, we will eagerly await your new novel.
Thank you.
Thank you for your short stories and for this conversation.
Thank you very much, Will.
So a big thank you to all of our 3 finalists in the novel short story category on this Meet the Authors panel. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards steward organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendar for Tuesday, April 22nd. That's the evening that the winner in this category and 9 other literary categories will be revealed. Please join us in St. Paul at the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets are $29, inclusive of processing fees. A free live stream will also be available. Visit thefriends.org/MBA for details. Thank you especially to our donors, individual and particularly our corporate donors. We see you, we know who you are, and you help make Minnesota a better place to live.